Now, our next guest is actually waiting on the line. It is Kris Gibson, and she is well known for her ongoing contribution towards Back to 60 and Sea Daughter-in-law's success. Her latest achievement is to bring on board the Green Party Women Group on the back of Caroline Lucas's membership of the Right Honourable Sir George Howarth ADR Group, alongside 8 party leaders and 70 cross-party parliamentarians. Hiya, Kris.
Hi, very pleased to speak to you again.
Oh, and you. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. I'm really, really excited because we have such good conversations, you and I, and I'm so pleased you're back on the show again. Now, you've spoken before about discrimination against 50s women. Why do you think there was a distinct lack of mention about discrimination in most of the election manifestos? What do you think?
Yeah, well, it does seem very much as though governments of all colours are only too happy to sweep discrimination against 50s women under the carpet. I think we all know they're very reluctant to pay out on any of the injustices that they've identified. Delay and obfuscation seems to be the order of the day. But I do wonder if the failure to discuss discrimination in the case of 50s women could be down to the size of the hole that Parliament has dug for itself, because this injustice is absolutely huge. It affects 3.8 million women, some of whom have since died. But, it does seem as though they're sweeping it under the carpet.
Yeah.
We were pretty dismayed by the manifestos that there was very little mention. It was striking. There was very little mention of the injustice done to 50s women. Sea Daughter-in-law actually published via David Henke's blog on his Westminster Confidential website a chart showing the various manifesto commitments. And the lack of mention of 50s women was very apparent. And where they were mentioned by different parties, notably it was absent completely from Labour manifesto, but where it was mentioned, it was generally in terms of the Parliamentary Ombudsman investigation into maladministration only. There was no mention of discrimination, and any mention of any kind of recompense was based on the scale of payments that can be offered through the Parliamentary Ombudsman, which is a very limited scale, with the top level of discrimination only paying out, a few £1,000s, and certainly not the huge sums that 50s women have lost.
Absolutely.
And the point I wanted to make really was that it's not as if they don't know about the discrimination. Hundreds of MPs have signed various early day motions clearly recognising discriminatory employment and pension laws. And as you probably know, Labour promised £58 billion back in 2019 prior to the last election to remedy the injustice. And they were speaking at that time of a moral obligation. And I just want to say that any settlement that fails to take account of discrimination will not represent justice. As you know, the judge's report from the Sea Daughter-in-law People's Tribunal found irrefutable evidence of direct and indirect discrimination, and also ongoing.
Yeah, it was proven, wasn't it?
Yeah, so, it's a very wide-ranging paper talking about the huge impact in many different aspects of 50s women's lives. The evidence is very, very extensive, and I'd just like to remind the majority of MPs, those who were in post in 2022, have all had a copy of that, and many of them have signed the early day motions recognising discrimination. It's hard to imagine any major policy change that would have a bigger impact on exacerbating existing inequalities than that of taking a total of £181.4 billion from one of the most disadvantaged groups in society, when those women had a legitimate expectation to receive that money and had planned for it all their lives and were simply, in many, many cases, not informed that they weren't going to get it.
That's right. And how do you think the lack of representation at the table affects progress on women's issues?
Well, do you know, I discovered recently that when decisions on the 1995 Pensions Act were made, there were only 9% of women MPs. And in 2011, when the second major act was passed, there were only 22% of women. And you wonder, how can Parliament truly represent women's concerns, especially those of working class women, with whom they would have little in common and little understanding of the restrictions they faced throughout their lives? Yep. Professor McKinnon, an academic who was writing for the group Right to Equality, actually commented that power in Parliament and the legal system is concentrated in the hands of largely privileged white men whose experiences are reflected in the law, leaving women and girls suffering invisibly on the statute books. So we've had some pretty good progress recently with the election of so many women MPs. Congratulations to Labour, the Green Party, Plaid, who have a good balance of male and female MPs now. But the total is only just over 40% women MPs, and other parties have still got a lot of work to do. Progress in ministerial positions is good, but you still have to remember that there's the Lords, the senior civil service, all the special advisors. Those are the ones who've got the ear of government. And unless you've got women in senior posts who have the ear of government too, you're not going to get women's rights considered properly. No. And you have to temper all of this with the fact that new women MPs have already been warned about the sexist and patriarchal culture at Westminster.
Do you want to talk briefly about the GR40, just in case people listening don't know what it is?
Yeah, GR40, the CEDAW committee wants to do something about women's lack of representation and the fact that women's voices are just not heard. They consider that long-term and structural absence of women, and this is globally, not just in the UK, the absence of women from decision-making systems constitutes a serious human rights violation, and it also deprives the world of realising the full potential of half of the population. I think it's been calculated that the impact on the gross domestic product would actually be huge if only governments would speak to women and include women in their decision-making. So it's a new general recommendation. GR40 is being developed currently through CEDAW, and it aims to rectify this. But of course, before that can have any sway in this country, we do need the government to incorporate the principles of CEDAW into domestic law.
Yeah. What do you think, we're just another couple of minutes before because we've obviously asked you to choose your track as well and everything. But what do you think is going to happen now?
Well, we've enjoyed support from a large number of MPs over the years on the early day motions calling for restitution. More recently, the cross-party group, which you mentioned in the introduction. We have had support from the Scottish Parliament for the full implementation of CEDAW, and we've had support from the Welsh Parliament, and Jackie will say more about that. We've had lots of petitions signed, and we need more people to sign that as a matter of some urgency. New MPs must recognise the impact of discrimination alongside maladministration But there are two things specifically that I want to mention that ought to be happening.
Yep.
The Labour Women's Conference recently, it was last autumn, in relation to a motion on equal pay, they actually pledged or passed a motion to ask the Labour government or Labour Party to actively pursue global goals to achieve women's equality and empower all women and girls through Section 5 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but also CEDAW. So the Labour Women's Conference is pushing for CEDAW to be properly implemented, and certainly this would be a step forward. The second thing that I want to mention is that back in 2019 there was a new piece of legislation to do with implementation of the Istanbul Convention, which was about domestic violence. And Stella Creasy put together some written evidence for the government. Part of that evidence actually said that it's important to note that from the date that an international treaty enters into force for the UK, it places international obligations on the UK. And also pleading an insufficiency in your domestic law is not, under international law, an acceptable excuse for failure to implement the provisions of the treaty. Well, you can't argue those things in one context, which was to do with domestic violence, but ignore it in the case of 50s women. So, government took no notice of CEDAW principles when they implemented the changes to state pension age, and they're supposed to be promoting substantive equality, and that actually means not only equality of opportunity, but more specifically, equality of outcome. And it's the equality of outcome that they have not considered in terms of the impact on 50s women of the pensions legislation.
Yeah, and according to Joe, the team's social media has been censored. Is that correct?
Well, we're finding enormous difficulty. It's not just the social media team, it's also many of our followers who are complaining that they're having labels put on their accounts, frequently having to prove we're human because we get messages saying there's been unusual activity, and all we're doing is promoting, aspects of CEDAW in law's work. Our reach is being reduced and tweets disappear down timelines. I can do a tweet and then I can't find it myself. It disappears way down the timeline, and it just seems to us as though something very strange.
A bit odd, isn't it? It's very odd.
Yeah.
Very odd. Honestly, it's so lovely to chat with you once again, Kris. I'm just going to move on only because we've got another couple of guests. But before we go, massive thank you. And also, do you want to introduce the song that you've chosen for us? Yes. I could do that if I can remember what it was. It was Leslie Gore, wasn't it? It was, and it was.
You Don't Own Me.
Yes.
I think it's about women sticking up for themselves.
Absolutely. It's a brilliant song. Thank you, Kris.
Yeah. Thank you ever so much, Hayley.
Thank you, love.
To talk to you.
Thank you. Bye.